Hey, what's up? It's Dean Bokhari. Welcome back to the Meaningful Show podcast. Listen, today I have an interview for you with a gentleman named Alfie Kohn. He is a world-renowned author. He's written 16 different books. He's appeared on places like Oprah. And what we're going to talk about today are those areas of human motivation and human behavior that we sort of have underexplored, that are commonly held myths that he is just going to totally bust for us. And we're going to focus today on the subject of competition. Is it really healthy? Is it really something that motivates us to do better? And if you think it motivates us, if you think that it helps you do better, if you think that it sort of competing with people in business, in life, in school, at work, helps you become a better person at your craft, then you're totally in for a surprise, because that's what I thought until I started reading Alfie's stuff and until I started having conversations with him. So I really think you'll enjoy this episode, and I really think it'll bust some commonly held myths and beliefs that we hold as a culture, society and culture holds regarding the subject of, competition makes you better. So tune in, enjoy this episode, and come on over to meaningfulhq.com afterwards for the show notes. So before we dive into today's episode of the podcast, real quick, sponsors. So today's episode is brought to you by getflashnotes.com, where you can get top business and self-improvement book summaries that you can read or listen to in under 20 minutes apiece. Again, that's getflashnotes.com. You can get started for $1, and if you like it, keep it. If you don't, cancel any time. But we've got business and self-help books that we've summarized, condensed, compressed the key takeaways from, and allow you to sort of just read them or listen to them in under 20 minutes. Today's podcast is also brought to you by a new partner that we've got, which is an Amazon company called Audible, where they do audio books. And I'm talking about the full, entire audio books condensed into MP3 files that you can listen to on your iPhone, your Android, your Kindle, just like getflashnotes.com, but it's the full version. Now check this out. We've got a deal with them where you can actually get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial, totally free, at audibletrial.com/Dean. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Dean. And I'll link all this stuff up in the show notes over at meaningfulhq.com. And that's all I've got for you, baby. Welcome to the show. Let's dive into it. And I will talk to you in just a second. Hey, what's up? It's Dean Bokhari coming back at you with another episode of the Meaningful Show podcast, where every week we work to bring you an inspiring person or message to help you live better, work better, and be better both in life and in business. Now, if you've ever wondered whether competing with others in life, in school, at work, or in business is actually a healthy thing, then stay tuned to today's episode, because we're going to talk about competition. We're going to be joined by an author named Alfie Kohn, who's written a string of best-selling books that debunk commonly believed myths about education and human behavior, including titles like Punished by Rewards, The Trouble with Gold Stars, Incentive Plans, A's, Praise, and Other Bribes, as well as books like No Contest, The Case Against Competition, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So, Mr. Kohn, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Glad to be here.
So if you could, tell us a little bit about your story and what got you into writing about human behavior and subjects like education and competition.
Well, I've always been fascinated by what makes people tick. And at some point, I decided I was particularly intrigued by the intersection between human behavior and social change, how we can make this a more just society, and what that says about individuals and why they do what they do, and vice versa. So the first book I wrote is actually the one I think you'd like to talk about today, No Contest, which deals with competition, and that led to related questions that manifested themselves in other books and in many articles and lectures, which is how I spend my time delivering these messages to parents, managers, teachers, and others around the country.
Yes, I found the book that I've read of yours, not the one that we're going to be talking about today, but the title that I mentioned previously during our communications was Punished by Rewards, and that was a fascinating book to me.
Oh.
So yeah, thank you for writing all of this and your work. I really appreciate it because it's honest, it's research driven, and it's really it's eye opening.
I guess I'm always intrigued when what people believe and what they do is at variance with what research actually says is true. And that divergence continues to irk and fascinate me and has led me to write about a number of other issues, many of them now dealing with education and parenting, where the data point in one direction and we're doing something else entirely, right?
Yeah.
And that all of that started, I guess, when I looked at America's state religion, which is competition. The assumption being that in order to be good, in order to have a fulfilling life, in order to have fun, you have to defeat other people. So there's a cluster of myths that competition is inevitable because it's just human nature, that it's more productive, that it builds character, that it's the only way to have fun. And so step by step in No Contest, I drew on research from many different fields, from psychology, sociology, anthropology, biology, economics, and so on, to debunk those misconceived assumptions.
So let's talk about some of those. So when would you say that competition is a healthy thing, and when would you say that it's an unhealthy thing or a bad or detrimental thing?
Well, I went into that project in the early 80s, assuming that the problem is just that competition is overdone, that we do it frenetically, fanatically, counterproductively, too early in children's lives. But if we keep things in perspective, then some competition can be useful and productive, or at least innocuous. But more than 30 years later and hundreds of studies later, I have been unable to find a single example where competition, I believe, is ever healthy or sensible. At work, at school, at play, it is never necessary to set things up so that you have to fail in order for me to succeed.
How would you say, Mr. Kohn, that for example, in arenas that are literally just predicated on competition, let's say sports, for instance, right? I mean, in that situation, in scenarios, in every scenario, in the sports industry, I mean, you have to defeat somebody in order to. I mean, that's
right.
The
That's
whole
the
game,
rules
right?
of the game. But let's back it up a step and ask the question: in order to have fun, to play a game, is it necessary to play a competitive sport? To have a bunch of people who cooperate only for the purpose of triumphing over another bunch of people who are cooperating? Or is there a different way to have fun besides sports for children and for adults? And I have a whole chapter on that in the book. So, for example, many things that folks enjoy doing and can do on their own, like running or swimming or skiing or lifting weights, never have to be corrupted by setting us against others, so that now the point isn't just to do those things well, to enjoy them, to develop skills, but to crush somebody else who's trying to do the same thing. And then the second category is group activities. And then the question is it possible to set up games so that a bunch of us can play without it being an us against them scenario, what George Orwell called war minus the shooting? And if you're raised in this culture, you may never have been exposed to cooperative games. You think that the only way to have fun is to play sports where you're trying to prevent other people from succeeding. And the whole purpose is to sort the players into winners and losers. But for many decades, there have been resources for kids and adults alike, for indoor games and outdoor games, in which things are set up so that all of us playing have to figure out how to do a task in a certain way or within a certain time constraint so that all of us sink or swim. And, just to give you one example from a guy named Terry Orlick in Canada who wrote the Cooperative Sports and Games book, he started out by giving the example of the game that was the first one I ever learned at birthday parties when I was a kid, where you have N people scrambling desperately to fit on N-1 chairs when the music stops.
Right.
So when the music stops the first time, somebody doesn't get there on time and is booted out of the game.
Right.
And then you do it again and again and again, out, until at the end, you've got one kid triumphant, the winner, everybody else excluded from play, unhappy, losers. That's how you learn to have a good time in America. So Orlick says, why don't you take away a chair each round, but change the goal? So now the point is for all of the kids to fit on a diminishing number of seats until at the end they're hanging on to each other and the rungs of the chair, giggling. Everyone plays to the end. It's challenging, but man, is it fun for everyone. So what he's pointing out is that sports, as we're used to them, is predicated on the idea of artificial scarcity.
Right.
But that's not only unnecessary for having a good time. You don't know how much fun competitive sports aren't until you finally had the chance to play cooperative games instead.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's kind of like the guy who just takes, doesn't really know how great it feels to actually give. It kind of reminds me.
And the nice thing about cooperation is, I've written about altruism and giving in another book, but with cooperation, it's not just a matter of giving unselfishly. It's a matter of all of us work together so all of us succeed. And this is just one chapter. I'm actually I could talk for 2 hours about competition without ever mentioning sports and games, but, I'm happy to talk about it if you bring it up. I'm more interested in the damage that competition does, not only to our mental health and our relationships, but to our productivity and success.
That's what I was going to actually ask you next. Yeah. What are the
workplace in the classroom?
Yeah, that's what I was going to actually get to. Is it, how about,
Sure.
So two things, in the classroom, what are the, how does it affect a child's mind to know that they're sitting in a classroom competing with every other person that's all of their peers sitting in that classroom,
Right.
to the left of them, in front of them, behind them, to the right? It's all a competition, number-based system. What are the implications of that on a child's mind, and how do they deal with that? And then also next is, in the workplace and in business, which we have to talk about as well.
Well, first, we have to carefully socialize children in school to look upon everyone else as potential obstacles to their own success. So they treat this as just a fact of life or an ingredient for productivity,
right.
So that they've been, in effect, brainwashed to think you have to do it, and it's unrealistic or utopian to think that you could look upon other people as potential collaborators. So they're already, for workplaces that don't just rate them, but rank them against one another.
Yeah.
Now, the effects are these. Number one, it undermines psychological health. Study after study after study finds that whether you win or lose is not the relevant factor. It's whether you had to attempt to learn or work in a competitive versus a non-competitive environment. So even if you win, you feel that you're only as good as your last victory, which is a recipe for neurosis. The second effect is the way it undermines our relationships with other people. We tend to envy winners and have contempt for losers and be skeptical or suspicious of just about everyone. Because even if you're not my rival today, you could be tomorrow. And so it makes sense in a competitive environment, not in life, to hold everyone at arm's length. And in effect, you look at everybody as an obstacle to your success. The third effect is that competition, say in a classroom, reduces kids' interest in whatever they're doing. And this is one of the most thoroughly replicated findings in social psychology, that people tend to become less excited about, less committed to whatever they're doing if the task becomes a means to an end, a prerequisite to getting some reward. And the only thing worse than a reward is an award, which is a reward that has been made artificially scarce. So even the kids who win and keep winning, and that's, of course, a small minority, seem excited and psyched for what they're doing. But it's not putting together a science project. It's not solving a math problem. It's not writing a poem. It's not the task that excites them. It's the idea of defeating other people so that when there's no longer a contest involved, they're actually less juiced to do the thing than they were to begin with.
Right.
And less interested in learning than kids lucky enough to be in a non-competitive environment, which leads to the fourth effect, and this is the one that would be most surprising to people raised in our culture. People do a poorer job on most tasks in a competitive environment, whether they ended up winning or not, than people who are A, in a non-competitive environment where my success doesn't affect yours one way or another, or B, ideally, a cooperative environment where kids are in pairs or small groups learning from and with one another. On the vast majority of tasks, especially where creativity or ingenuity is required, competition kills excellence. Yeah. Study after study proves that's true, and not just for kids, for adults. And that's why the most dysfunctional workplaces are companies where people have to try to beat each other for artificially scarce bonuses or promotions.
Yeah, and I've seen that environment. I've been in that environment. Luckily, no longer have to be concerned with that. But, I remember being in that type of situation where, there's teams pitted against teams, employees pitted against employees. Everyone's looking at the rankings every single morning when they
Right.
get to the office. It's like, oh, did I rise? Am I doing better than the other guy? And blah 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 blah. So what happens there, and how can we help people realize that there's a better way to do it?
Well, what happens there are the exact same effects that I just ticked off.
Yeah.
How do we help people? Well, I do what I can to, and I invite others to do the same, to talk with folks, to review the research. When I went into this, before I looked at any of the studies a long time ago, I was already skeptical about the psychological and interpersonal effects of competition. I already had an inkling that it gets in the way of health, psychological, mental health, and how we feel about each other. But I, being raised in America, assumed that competition, was, if it was done correctly, was productive. And that, we might have to sacrifice some productivity, some achievement in order to have happier, healthier people. And when I looked at the research, I found that was dead wrong. And so people who think of themselves as hard-bitten realists, who live in the real world and aren't so concerned about the soft, squishy stuff like people's feelings, they just want to look at the bottom line, have to realize, or at least invited to realize, that competition is as destructive to the bottom line as it is to the human beings who are engaged in the working and learning. And I mean, if I took a bunch of people, let's say there's 100 people in front of me, and I divide them into two groups randomly, and I give them all some task to perform, where they have to figure out some puzzle or create some innovative way of solving a problem. And the only difference between the two groups is that one of them is told, here, see if you all can figure this out. And the other half is told, this is a contest and there'll be a prize for whoever comes up with the best idea. What the research consistently shows across ages, genders, and cultures is that on average, people in the competitive group will do a poorer job. Competition gets in the way of excellence. And we have to help people understand that, not just so they can change their personal attitudes, but so they can organize to change the structures that trap us in a competitive environment that is inherently dysfunctional. And that word inherently is key here. It's not just a matter of how much you compete, how often you compete, how you set up the rules of the competition, or what attitudes you bring to it. Whenever you set things up so that one person has to fail for another to succeed, that's going to be counterproductive. And that's the structure we have to change at work, at school, at home, at play.
It just seems like it's just so deeply embedded within every aspect of our society and culture that I mean, I wouldn't even know. There's just so many things running through my mind. I wouldn't even know where to begin and try.
Yeah.
Even thinking about it from an individual level, right? How does one deal with, for instance, let's say you're in business and you sell widgets, and then you see that, Joe from widget company across the street is all of a sudden doing a lot better than you are now. How, right. I mean, that doesn't make anybody feel good. How does an individual deal with that?
Right. That's extremely difficult. In a way, it's parallel to your earlier question of, but if you're playing sports, how can you do that non-competitively? And the answer is you can't. You have to try to have fun in a different way.
Yeah.
And so it is with our economic system, which is predicated on the idea of some people trying to defeat other people at what they're doing. And the magic of the marketplace says everybody is supposed to benefit from that. Now, I'm not an economist, but I do take maybe 10 pages in my book, No Contest, to ask if the research so overwhelmingly shows that competition within a group is like a company is destructive. Why would we assume that multiplied across a much larger arena that it suddenly becomes more productive? And I'm not just talking about the effect on the companies that go out of business. Often not because they produced an inferior widget, but because they started out with less, or they were less lucky, or they weren't as skilled at marketing their widgets as being better, even when they're not. Or they didn't spend enough time trying to undermine the widget company that ended up succeeding. I'm talking about how competition is destructive even for the individuals in the company that won, that persisted, that increased their market share. Never mind the ancillary effects.
So what about, so let's say the company who says, for instance, the company who succeeded, right? The guy who is running a company, or the group of people, for instance, that have crushed the competition, and they're all happy, and they're just, jumping around, giving each other high fives, thinking that they're just on top of the mountain. What are the negative implications on those individuals in the short term and long term?
First, they invoke competitiveness to justify shipping the jobs to the Philippines or to Mexico so they can pay people less and continue to beat their competition, so that what we win supposedly as consumers by getting cheaper widgets, we lose as producers or workers by being paid less. Second, the more competitive the industry is, the more worker safety is compromised and the environment is compromised. Never mind the mental health and stability and life outside the workplace of those who are pressured to keep working longer hours and harder just so that the company can succeed, which often means a disproportionate share of the benefits going to those who own the company, not to those who actually do the work day by day. But what's interesting about all of this, I think, is that the pressure to succeed and to win in a competitive environment, which leads to economic questions about alternatives, and how we create an alternative to that is democratic in an economic arena, doesn't challenge what the research clearly shows and where we could begin, which is to look at the destructive effects of adding the poison of competition to how we organize the individual workplace.
Right.
That's a place we can start. Even people who are not willing to go there, and talk about what would an economic system look like. It wasn't about companies trying to defeat each other and create losers all the time. Can certainly begin by asking, how can we get rid of the poison of competition within an organization where it is patently dysfunctional?
And so how would they get rid of it? By cultivating collaboration, teamwork, an environment where people aren't scared of each other?
Well, yes, that would be the second step, is to affirmatively create a genuinely cooperative or collaborative environment. The first step is just to get rid of anything that's competitive. I mean, there's three ways of organizing any task. You can do it against each other, apart from each other, or with each other. So the first step is to move from against each other, which is competition, to a more independent arrangement where we're at least not trying to kill each other. So you would never, for example, set people against each other in a workplace as a contest, or give out awards, that recognition ceremonies to who's better than whom, and so on. Then you move to what you said, which is the ideal situation where you have all kinds of cross-cutting groups where people are parts of simultaneously different kinds of collaborative organizations where we try to create a system that's better. Again, it's not just about changing the attitudes, of you should like each other more. It's about changing the structure that causes people to distrust each other. Right. If my department is competing against your department for some recognition, for a trip to Hawaii, or one salesman's competing against another one for a new car or a bonus, then people's attitudes fall in line with the system so that they begin to distrust each other and try to undermine each other, because that's the rational thing to do in an irrationally competitive environment. It's the environment that has to be changed.
So let's say that an organization, any organization, has successfully cultivated an environment that's based on cooperation and teamwork, and they've really just built up just a positive environment within the organization. So now let's blow it up on a bigger scale and ask the question, well, now how does that organization deal with the organization across the street again? I mean, it's just the same question from an individual level now, just looking at it from a team or business organizational level.
You're clearly limited in what you can do when the economic system as its engine, competition, because of the belief that that's valuable. In fact, if companies share what they know with each other, if they're in the same industry within a competitive environment, we call that collusion or acting in restraint of trade. Just like when kids share what they know with each other in most traditional classrooms, we call that cheating, even though it's the most optimal arrangement. Yeah. So, there we have to think about alternatives to an economic system built on competition. And some countries have done that by saying, look, if we want to keep these widget makers honest, we don't have to do it by creating other widget makers to try to eat their lunch. We can do it by creating a democratic approach, which is very different from a competitive approach, where, say, the whole organization, the company, is owned by consumers or by the workers as a worker cooperative. So then you can have, let's say, as is the case in Sweden, where last time I checked, the largest fuel oil distributor, the largest insurance provider, the largest department store chain are cooperatives. It
would be so much more of a beautiful world, I feel like, just if we, instead of companies trying to compete with one another and one insurance company trying to do better than the other insurance company, or one, car maker trying to, market, focusing so much more on marketing instead of actually creating a better product.
That's right.
Where would we be if everybody literally just tried to work together, not hide information from one another, just keep everything open source and just work on making the best possible, product they
see? I don't think that's just a sort of fanciful utopian question. I think it's a hard-headed question to look at how much effort and resources are wasted. I mean, our healthcare system, for example, is the most expensive in the world, and we give poorer healthcare because it's based on competition.
Yeah.
And even, Obamacare's tiny move in the direction of helping to make healthcare more affordable to low-income people still leaves for-profit insurance companies firmly in the saddle, which is why they love it, and which is why we continue to waste tens of billions of dollars because of the dogma of competition and the waste that it necessarily generates, because they're trying to figure out how they can exclude people who are expensive to insure. And that's true in many different arenas as well. If you have a democratically elected government running the way most industrialized countries do, running this, then you still have problems. But at least you don't have this level of waste because of the magical thinking that says when some people are trying to destroy other people, everybody supposedly gains. But for people who find this talk a little too radical and a little too difficult to tackle in the immediate future, as I said, in my book, No Contest, I spend 10 pages on this. The rest of the book is about stuff we can do and where the research is very, very strong about transforming competitive environments in individual families and workplaces and schools into environments that are more about how we can collaborate and thereby be not only happier and healthier, but more productive. And that's stuff we can do next week, not in the next generation.
So what's one thing that a young professional or a middle-aged professional can do here in the United States to kind of take the next step forward in terms
first, to realize the need for taking that step. The first step is to realize that competition is inherently destructive. It's not just a matter of, regulating the amount that it's done.
Right.
And you realize that the problem is with the whole idea of setting people against each other. Then you begin quite naturally to find examples of where you can move beyond it with yourself and with your children, and where you reach out to people you work with to say, how can we figure this out together instead of the kind of secrecy and distrust that tends to follow inevitably from a dogma, an ideology of competition. How that plays out in terms of other things concretely that people do will depend on the situations and organizations in which they find themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alfie, for being here and providing us with your expertise. I really appreciate it. How can people find you if they wanted to get in touch or learn a little bit more?
Through my website, which is my name, Alfie Kohn, ALF as in Frank, IEKOHN.org.
Perfect. And I'll go ahead and link this up and a link to your website as well as the books that we discussed here at meaningfulhq.com in the show notes. Thanks again, Alfie. I really appreciate it. And We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.